Okay, so now we are recording, and last time we were seeing, after seeing some history, we were seeing about how we do deep learning today. We mentioned that there are many types of, let's say, formal problems from the point of view of computer vision that can be solved with deep learning. This is an image from a paper that's been quite popular that we published in 2021, I think, where some of these problems are shown using forestry examples. So we have semantic segmentation, classification, localization, which is not so popular, object detection, which very much is, and instance segmentation. In semantic segmentation, we assigned one label value to each pixel to get a detailed map of what is in every pixel of the image. And this problem is very used, for example, in self-driving cars and in many other things. In classification, we only give one label to every image. So we classify the images into the different classes. The ImageNet contest that brought deep learning into mainstream popularity in 2016 is a classification contest. Localization, as I said, well, is popular but has been subsumed by object detection, where you do classification of many possible objects, like we see here. And again, things like pedestrian detection are very popular today. In my own research with the forestry lab, we do tree classification lately, not with lots of success so far, although we are getting there. And if you need not only to detect the objects, but also to give them detailed contours, and you're doing instance segmentation. And there are others. Basically, you can define your own networks and use your own annotations to solve other problems. But these are the big families that everyone is using. In order to solve any of these problems, we need to feed models to data. Okay? You already know how to do that from linear regression that we saw a little bit last week. So we have a model defined by a number of parameters. In the case of linear regression, it's just A and B, the slope of the line that we're fitting and the B which moves the line. But in the case of deep learning networks, these models are much bigger. But conceptually, the thing is the same. We have data in a number of dimensions. And in general, the data that we have for deep learning has many dimensions, okay, which we are going to try to predict. And then we try to fit models into that data. But you can think as a shortcut in the case of linear regression. In linear regression, you have simple 2D data and you try to fit a model with two parameters into it. And as we saw last time, you do predictions with the current values of the model. You compute a loss function to see if you're very far from the data or not so far. And then you use the backward. To do predictions, you do the forward step for your model. And in order to update the parameters of the model, you do the backward step. You compute the derivative of your model, of the loss function applied to your model. And then you try to minimize that loss function, because to minimize, you need to compute the derivatives of your model, just like in high school when you computed, when you wanted to compute the minimum or maximum values of a function, you computed this, you looked for the zeros in the derivative. Here it's the same, only you have higher dimension functions, functions not only with one x or y, but with many of them. So we do this backward step, this optimization step, to generate using an optimizer, which can be different optimizers, but they all use these derivatives to generate the next set of values for the model, and we iterate that. Every time we do that, we do the prediction, computation of the loss, and backward step. This is one epoch. We repeat this for as many epochs as we need. Okay. when we do deep learning models for practical problems, we have to think about this mindset. We have defined the problem, classification, segmentation, whatever. We define a model and we try to fit it using those 3 steps. Okay. So we have an input, which is our data. For example, in this case, the SIG3 images from Zhao Mountain. A model with potentially many parameters, and then an output that we want to get from that model once it has been properly fitted, it has been properly trained. Here is what we say, this is the learning step, this adjusting of the parameters. And maybe it's interesting to stop for a second here. Is the model really learning anything? Is there anyone doing any learning here? No, this is just, shall I say, marketing. In artificial intelligence, from the beginning, the point has to be to establish parallelisms with the way our human brains work. So instead of saying model fitting, we say learning step to make it look like that model is actually a brain and it's learning on its own. It's not. We are just fitting the parameters of the model. We are changing the parameters of the model with a process that is long and complex and can and we kind of lose track of it, okay? Because we need to do all of these prediction, loss function computation, derivatives, generate new parameters, okay? So because all of these steps involve big matrices and are kind of long, it can look a little bit like magic. We start with a huge model and we end with a model with proper parameters that help us in some way. Okay, so it's like a little bit the example of the car. You drive a car and you know a little bit what's going on there, but you do not know the fine details. When you hear in the news, we do not know how deep learning models really work, how artificial intelligence really works. That is what they actually mean. It's very bad faith of them to say it that way in general media, because it looks like the thing is learning on its own and we are out of control. We don't know what's happening. That is not true. We may not be aware of the importance of every small step that is taken there, that happens there, but we programmed all of those small steps. And if we took the time of following all of them, we could learn which ones are important and which ones are not so important. Okay. The thing is that that wouldn't particularly matter. We want the final trained model, and that's why it kind of looks like magic, because the process is a little bit complex and we do not follow each step in detail. But that doesn't mean that there is any mystical thing going on. It's just we haven't acquired that knowledge because we don't particularly want to, but we know how the process works. We have programmed the process and everything is completely understood. Okay. Big AI popes saying we don't know what AI is capable of. We don't know what AI is learning. Those guys probably have some other interest. The way to train models is unsexy and deeply established, and everyone knows what's going on there. Okay, and no one is learning anything. We are just fitting parameters to a model. Okay. How do we fit those parameters to a model? We need a training step, this learning step. We give lots of examples to the model, the data together with the correct answer. In our image classification example, we give lots of images together with the code of the species that belongs to each image. So this is one image and this is species number 1. This is another image and this is species number 1 too. This is another image and that's species number 46. Okay, we give the network lots and lots and lots of data together with the correct annotation. We pass the data through the network and the network tries to reproduce the annotations that we have given it. At first, it predicts randomly, because at first, all of the parameters of the model, which is usually called the weights of the model, all of those weights usually are random. And let's put a small asterisk here, because they are not really, but let's consider that initially they are all random, okay? When we start predicting with random weights, what we will get very likely is a very bad result. So our model will initially be very far from the data. So when we start generating the new set of parameters for the new epoch, we will probably do a big step, a big change in all of our parameters using our optimizer. Second step, second epoch, we will again run the images again through the network, predict again, and maybe we have improved a little bit. If we have, we will continue moving in that direction. The optimizer will continue changing the parameters of the model similarly. If we have not improved, then some other change will happen. Okay, the optimizer will do some different change. How does the optimizer work? There are many of them, but basically they are generalizations of things like the Newton method. So they are, again, not particularly inspired or not particularly magic. Okay, there are many optimizers that can be used, but they are all boringly numerical method computation. Okay, and so on and so forth. Hopefully, with enough epochs, we get to train a model that can solve the problem for our training data. What do I mean by solve the problem here? And this is important. I mean that by the end of the training phase, hopefully, when I give the model one of my training images, it is able to predict its label correctly. Okay. This is a data fitting problem. And it happens exactly the same if we are trying to identify three species, or if we are trying to detect where kanji are in a page, or if we are trying to predict text. If I'm ChatGPT, if the model is ChatGPT and it's trying to predict the text to answer a question that the user has made. The training process is always the same. The model receives some data, passes the data through itself, gets an answer, and then adjusts its own parameters and iterates this until the model is able to reproduce the answers contained in the training data. So training process is theoretical. It's about fitting data, fitting a model to data, and there is no meaning involved here in any way. So it happens the same with any type of data. It happens the same if the data is true or false. So if I feed lots of text about how Iago is the most intelligent person in the world, ChatGPT will learn to reproduce that. And every time you ask ChatGPT who is the most intelligent person of the world, it will answer Iago in different colorful ways. Okay? That's of course true. I'm joking. There is no provision for truth, for accuracy, for morality here. It's just about reproducing patterns inside of the data. Okay? There is also no agency, no survival instinct, no ethics, just fitting data, fitting model to the data. Okay? Okay. Then we have a second step. I will also say, sorry, I put an asterisk before saying initially the weights are random. Usually they are not actually random. We take weights that someone else trained with a different data set that is similar to our problem. For example, if we are doing the image classification, usually we start with the weights from the ImageNet network. And we do something that's called transfer learning. We hope that the weights that correspond to the ImageNet network will help us also classify, in our case, trees. Why? Because, well, in the ImageNet, you have all of these 100,000 classes, dog, cat, plane, many, many things. So we don't need those, but probably there are parts of the network that are tuned to, I don't know, separate objects within images, to find borders, to find places where there are changes in pixel intensity, to detect edges in this case, for example, or to see gradations in color. By modifying the different parts of the network, I end up with small parts of the network that do those things, even if I don't particularly know which one is which. Okay, I could. People do take the time sometimes to go a little bit deeper and see when I pass an image that has very clear edges through the network, which parts of the network have a higher value. Okay, but in general, that's done. It's part of a bit of about the haze of the network, the magic of the network, but it's there somewhere. Okay, and when I have done that, probably if now I try to use these same weights, the ones that identify edges, for example, or changes in color, for a problem like tree classification, where those things are also important, then probably those are going to help me. In any case, as a very eminent person in this area said, they are probably not going to hurt. So the normal practice is not to start from random weights, but to start from weights from a similar problem trained in a large dataset. For image classification, it's almost always the ImageNet dataset. Okay. After I have completed this training step, and I will tell you in a second a lot more about how to do this in Pytorch for task number 2. Okay. Then we want to test our model. There is one more dataset. I'm talking about the training dataset. And now I have jumped to the testing dataset, and I'm jumping over the validation dataset, but let's put a pin on that. The testing dataset is a dataset where only we have the answers. The network predicts what the answer for this new data that the network hasn't seen the correct answers to, and then we predict how well that works. Okay, so in the training step, the network receives the data together with the correct answers and changes its parameters using the optimizer, changes the parameters of the network until we get the best possible fit between the training data and the model. In the second step, in the testing step, we receive new data and we do not give the correct answers to the model. We just ask the model, if I give you this image, what class do you predict here? And the model will give us the answers, and then we will evaluate how well the model did. Okay. And as we will see, the training process is solving one theoretical data fitting problem. And the testing process is aiming at measuring that trained model, how well it does in the practical problem. In the testing dataset, we are really interested. Did we get the tree species right or not? Okay. Okay. So here are some examples of things that we have done for different processes, but let's go to the notebooks. We already saw the notebook about image processing, about the project number 3. And let's see a little bit of detail about how to implement datasets in Pytorch. Once I have done this, I will go back to the presentation and go again into this training, testing, and validation. Why are those 3 important, and what does it mean to understand them? Okay. Sorry, by the way, any questions? Now is the time to ask them.
I have one little question about learn transfer, if I remember correctly.
Transfer learning.
Yeah, thank you. Transfer learning. You said that we usually import width from other models
Yeah.
similar to the one we need to achieve. But how common are these pre-built models that we can use? I mean, I imagine that we need a model, as you said, similar to what we need to do. So how many are there out there?
So that's, again, a very good question. To be fully precise, what we import are weights for the exact same model that we are using. For example, a name of a classification model is ResNet 50, and we will be defining and using it. So we use weights for this exact model, but the model has been trained with a different similar problem. Okay? So the shape of the network, the number of parameters that it has, all of that is the same. Okay? And we copy the matrix. We put it instead of our own ResNet 50. We take the ResNet 50 that someone trained for ImageNet and we copy those weights. The only difference is that because ResNet 50 has 100,000 classes, the final part is a predictor with 100,000 probabilities for each image to belong to one of the classes. We throw away that part in what is called model fine-tuning, and we plug in a new one with random weights initially. In our case, for example, with 46 exits. Okay, so we keep most of the model, and the last layer, we throw it away and we substitute it for something that fits our own problem. How common are those? So they are very common, and there is a whole thing called model zoos. So there are databases with models trained in large data sets. So if you want to do ResNet 50 or ResNet 101 or come next, the models that are more or less famous that have had good performance in image classification tasks, you can download those very easily and you can use those very easily. When we use Pytorch, as we will see next week, downloading the ImageNet weights is just one flag in the model creation instruction. So we will say weights default. You can say weights random, and then you start with random weights, or you can say weights default, and those are the ImageNet weights. For object detection, there is a big data set called COCO. And by default, most models copy the COCO weights. Okay? So there are lots of databases containing those things. Even more, what does it mean to copy the weights from a similar model? Well, that's very hard to define. In practice, most people just use general weights. For example, if they are doing image classification, everybody uses ImageNet. If they are doing object detection, everybody uses COCO. But there are many, many more models, many people who have uploaded their results from their problem into these model zoos. So if you want to import weights from a problem that you believe is closer to your problem, you can do it. For example, in a 2020 paper, we studied a little bit about that. We wanted to classify drone images of trees, and we wanted to find three classes again, like you will do in project number 3. And we started with ImageNet weights, but we also found Planet called a dataset called Planet dataset, which basically classified satellite data and used that satellite data to find different things in the Amazon forest and so on. And we thought, okay, because this is seen from above and it's computing features of images that look a little bit like ours, this is going to be more similar to our tree classification problem than if we just do the ImageNet weights. And we did lots of experiments with that. The answer in the end was something like yes, the problem is more similar. Yes, if we do transfer learning from that planet dataset instead of from the ImageNet dataset, we do get slightly better results, but it's not really worth it in our case, in that problem. Because if we train our model for more epochs with the ImageNet initialization, we ended up more or less in the same place. Basically, we got very good results with both. With the Planet dataset, we got slightly better, but basically it didn't justify the hassle of having to look for a dedicated dataset and so on. I would say if your problem is strange and you don't have lots of data, probably finding one of these pre-trained models in one of these models can make a difference. If you have enough data, just going with ImageNet or the default weights, Coco, whatever, is going to be enough. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Okay, so let's go ahead. We are now focusing on how we do all of this definition of datasets in Pytorch. Pytorch, as you remember, is a deep learning library. There are others. I like Pytorch. I work in Pytorch, but there are many more. So I'm going to tell you about Pytorch, but most of the things that we do here can be done with other libraries, and they are not particularly worse than Pytorch. Pytorch is the one that I'm used to, and I think is one of the good libraries out there. I'm going to be using, basically, I'm going to give you an overview about Unit 4, and you should really read this with lots of detail because that's very similar to project number 3. Okay, so I'm going to go over it just to quickly explain the shape that datasets have in Pytorch. And then I'm going to go back to the presentation and use, after the presentation, this checkerboard classification notebook. That's also in the index. This is Computer Vision and Deep Learning Basics 3, AI Cannot Count. And I'm going to use this to explain a little bit about the difference between testing, validation, and training. Okay, so first, datasets. Important. What are datasets in Pytorch? Datasets are a way for us to communicate our data to Pytorch. Okay, what do I mean with that? Pytorch and any other deep learning processes library, as we said before, as we said last week, is just an automatic differentiation library. So it takes matrices that, when put together in creative ways, make these big models with lots of parameters and is able to differentiate, to find the derivatives of all of these big models made up of smaller but still pretty big matrices. Okay, so Pytorch doesn't know about trees, about kanji, about anything. It just knows about matrices. And it doesn't even call them matrices, it calls them tensors. That's why another very famous library is called TensorFlow. What's the difference between a matrix and a tensor? A tensor is kind of a generalization of a matrix. A matrix is very often visualized in 2D. So we have rows and columns, and tensors are kind of higher dimensional matrices. What does it mean that we have higher dimensional matrices? Well, on the one side, when we study matrices in high school, in every position of the matrix, we have one number. Okay? When we work with matrices in Pytorch, in every position of the matrix, in every pixel of the image, we very often have at least 3 values for the RGB. But we could have more. If we are doing drone image processing, maybe we have computed the DHM, the altitude map, and we have a 4th value. Or maybe we are using multispectral imaging, and for every pixel in our image, we actually have a long row of 6 values. So we have RGB, but we also have near infrared, red age, and so on and so forth. Or maybe we are doing hyperspectral image. So every pixel has a long list of hyperspectral bands, 10,000 bands, depending on the camera, for example. Okay. So on the one hand, our matrices, our tensors, have higher dimension in every pixel, in the number of channels that our data has. Okay. These pixel dimensions are called channels. RGB is 3 channel images. Our annotations, because they are grayscale, are 1 channel images. And if we use hyperspectral, multispectral, we can have more channels. Not only that, maybe we are processing data that's not 2D, that's not 2D images, 2D data. Maybe we are processing something that's bigger dimension. And I will not stop too much about this, but one very simple way is that maybe we want to do medical imaging and we are processing, for example, CT scans of the head or MRI scans of the head, of the breast, of wherever, of an arm. Those, if they are taken with a 3D scanner, are actually volumes. So they are not 2D images, but they are 3D images. And again, in those 3D images, every pixel can have 1, 2, 3, a million dimensions. So Pytorch can handle any version of that automatically. So it's very good at handling and managing and moving tensors, these generalized matrices. Okay? Because it is good at that only, it doesn't know what the data means, and it doesn't need to. It doesn't care. The people programming Pytorch do not care if the data that they are receiving is, again, text from ChatGPT or our images or sound from someone or temperature data from somewhere else. It's okay. It's going to be processed in the same way. Okay. Data sets are what we use to transmit that information to Pytorch. Basically, we take our data, our nice images, and we put them in a way that then Pytorch can interpret and can package and move within its tensor processing functions. So data sets are the way in which we communicate to Pytorch, in which we sort out, nicely package our data so that Pytorch can transform it into images that it can then feed to networks and process. Not only that, but Pytorch works in the GPU. So we want our model training, which is a long process because we have to do all of those epochs with many, many parameters to run in parallel. And we want it to run in parallel inside of the GPU. If we had to process it by hand every time, the derivatives, all those things, that would be very, very extremely annoying and long. And that's why we put things in a very specific way, and then Pytorch can not only take them, but also feed them to the GPU in nice batches and process it in parallel quickly, and then sort out the answers and give us the results. Okay, that's what datasets are for. And they need one very particular structure and shape. Okay, in this notebook, we start with the functions that created from our images and our mosaics and so on, what would be task number 1, that created the patches. Okay, so all of that, all of this code that I'm jumping over is the one to create the patches. In the previous notebook, Unit 3, you have all of these nicely explained, but here we just copy it. And then here we import the usual ones, enter the dataset class inside of Pytorch. Okay, we are saying here to Python, we are going to be working with these datasets. And our dataset that we defined, that we want to define, sorry, is a subclass of this dataset from Pytorch. What is this class, subclass thing? Are those the same classes that we want to predict than from our trees? No, this is something different. This is something called object-oriented programming, which sadly we do not have time to get into. But let's just say that this Pytorch dataset defines a series of rules. And when we say this, we define a class, like a group of code that is going to have the characteristics of our data and some functions to work with our data. Okay, we are saying that we are going to be using the characteristics of this dataset. Okay, can go much more into detail if someone wants me to. But basically, when we define a dataset, we need to define three things. We need to define an init function, an init method, like this one. We need to define a getItem method, and we need to define a length method. And you have lots of details here. Basically, let me just run over it really quickly. The point is that you can use most of this code as it is. You need to read this in some detail, understand a little bit more than what I'm going to tell you right now. I'm going to give you the basics, but you have to go a little bit deeper and see what the code is doing. There is plenty of comments here. But basically, we need to define this class, this code, with these three parts. The init part is where we are going to be taking our data and putting it in a nicer way. Okay. In this case, we spent task 1 breaking down our mosaics and so on and creating those patches. Okay. We could do all of that part here too, if we wanted. We could start the data set from the mosaics and the binary treetop images and so on. But because that would make the code longer, we have done part of the work before. So we changed from our site folders into some patches, some images from patches. And every image will have a very specific name, and that's something important that you have to do in task 1. So at this point, we have already done some of the processing and we have made things pretty and a little bit easier for this dataset class. And what are we going to do now? Well, now I want to take my data and package it into nice matrices for Pytorch to process. So what I'm doing here is that I'm iterating over all the files in one particular folder, okay? And I'm reading those, and this is a little bit complex, but basically what I do here is that I read those that have the word patch inside of it, and then they have different things. They have a code that's something like a species, blah, blah, and here they have a number, okay? For all the files that fit this structure, what I do is that extract the class from the file name. So in our case, it will be species something. And then I read the image and put it into a list of images. Okay, so in this init method, I'm taking my data, which is in the disk, and I'm reading it properly, and I'm putting it into a list of images read with OpenCV. So I'm transforming from something that's in disk that has some files with different names into something that is a list of images, essentially. Okay, so I'm doing all the preparations to have things nice and ready. Not only that, when I read an image, I also read its current class. So I read the label that goes with that image. And I also put that inside of a list. Okay. Yes, here, sorry. I have a label list and I put it inside of my label list. I also do something with the dictionary. Let's not stop at that at this moment, okay? So the first thing that I need to define in my dataset is something like this. Read things from the file and sort them out in a way that helps what we want to do. In your case, for task number 2, you can do pretty much the same. In task number 1, you have to store the images with some names that help you, and then you can do something very similar to this, and you can mostly use the same code, just adapting the format, and you don't even need to use regular expressions. The point is that every time you read a file, you have to identify whether or not that's a proper patch file, and if it is, you have to read the species from the name, and if you want to read the number. Okay, then read the image within breed, put it in a list, and then read the label and put that one in a list too. So now we have 2 lists, one with the images and one with the labels. Second important step, and almost the only other important step, get item. Pytorch is going to tell me, I need one more data unit, and we have to define what those data units are. And for the data units, we're going to have the input, the data itself, and the target, the correct answer. Okay? So basically, because we have done all the work in the init method, in getItem, what we do is that we just read when Pytorch asks me I need one more data unit, it's going to give me an index. So it's going to tell me I need data unit number 17 or 18. Okay, so I have to decide what the order of the data is too. Okay, because in init method we already did most of the work for that. It's going to be very easy. What does it mean for us, data 0, data 1, data 23? Well, the image and label that are at position 0, 1, or 23 in the list that we have defined. Because for every image that I read, I read it, put it in a list, and then put its label in a list with append. So I'm adding at the end of the list. At every position that I have of the 2 lists, I have the corresponding information, the image and its label. So when someone asks me information piece 10, I go to position 10 and read the image from the image list and read the label from the label list. And that's all that I'm doing here. Image list of index, and then that's what I want to read. Okay, and then I have some technical things here and some technical things there. Let me go to them in a second. But I read the image list and I read the label list too. Okay. And those are what label list of index, and those are what I return. The len method, the third and final method that I have to define for any type of data to become a data set that Pytorch can process, is even easier. I only need to define the length of my data. How much data do I have? Well, because I already did all the work in the init method, that just means return the length of the image list or of the label list. Okay? So that's what datasets do. They sort out our data so that we can give it to Pytorch. And we need an init method to sort things nicely and prettily, a getItem method to return one particular piece of information given an index, and the length so that Pytorch knows how many times it has to go. And then it will break everything into batches and so on and so forth and feed everything to the GPU. That's Pytorch job. Okay. Let me go to the couple of technical details, and then we will move on to the what does all of this really mean. And this, I am aware that this code is not simple. This can be a little bit overwhelming, but you're not supposed to create this code anew. You are supposed to understand more or less how this code works and do very small changes to it so you can use it. Okay. Technical things. Technical thing number 1, I have this NP move axis. Okay. So I read my image here, current image, and when I'm putting it into the list, I'm not putting it as is, but I'm doing this move axis thing. And that's because the way the image dimensions are stored in OpenCV And the way the image dimensions are stored in Pytorch is not the same, sadly. Okay, so Pytorch and OpenCV do not speak exactly the same language. As we said before, OpenCV doesn't exactly speak anyone's language but its own. Okay, so we need to do this move axis. We are basically sorting out the information a little bit, and that's taken care of by this. Also, we have this in getItem, we have this as type npfloat32. This means that when I have read an image, not only do I have to shift this axis, but I also have to see the pixels as float values instead of as integer values. And that's another characteristics of Pytorch and all of these libraries. They process matrices, but they process only real number matrices. So if we have integers, we have to see them as float, as real numbers. Okay, this is the second conversion that we have to do. Finally, this self classes dict is a dictionary because we read code. This is slightly annoying, but we read the code from the species that we have before, from our different species, for example, in our trees. But we do not want to use that exact number, and that's annoying. But basically, if we want to use if we have one species that we don't have in our sites, if we have species 1, 2, and 57, we do not want to use as codes 1, 2, and 57 because that might very easily lead us to having a 58 entry vector in the end. So what we do is we assigned number 1 to 1, number 2 to species 2, and 57 becomes species 3. And that's what this is doing. If the current class that we have read is the new class, then we make a note in our dictionary saying this current class, this new class is whatever the length of the dictionary is. So if we had 5 classes, this is going to be class number 6. Okay. And then we append this code, and that's what we use to process. That's essentially what you need to do for task number 2. Be careful with task number 1 in how you store the images, and be sure to use them properly here so you can read the name of the image and the species inside of that name. Have a good look at this. Solving this is probably the, let's say, trickiest part of project number 3. Ask me questions. I have only given an overview here, slightly detailed overview, but understanding this in detail probably requires you to have a long look at all of this information. Okay. Let me go back to the presentation, but now I'm giving again a couple of minutes for questions. Okay, no questions at the moment. Well, then let's use the next 25-30 minutes to talk a little bit about what these data sets actually mean, okay? So, for example, here we have some of the problems that we have used in research. In this one, we wanted to classify supple pine bushes in, again, Zhao Mountain into these classes. And this one was challenging because many of the classes were very similar and it was very difficult to tell them apart. Some of them have more or less different colors. Some others were very, very similar. So we built patches like you are going to do, and we try to classify them. By the way, all of these white things are the dead fir trees as a result of successive insect infestations in a fir forest that is the one that sustains the very touristic Zhao snow monsters. We have here some examples of patches that we built, and as you can see, this is a complex problem. We have data from This means June, 6 months of the year, and this is October. And here you have the different species. There are some evergreen species that look pretty similar all year round, and 3 deciduous species that change color and look pretty different in August than in June, in summer and in autumn. Okay, and that was something that made our problem a little bit more difficult. This is the data that you have in all of the course notebooks, not the data that you will use for project number 6, but the one that you have in the notebook that I was showing you before. Let's go back to the training, validation now, and testing data. So the training data determines the behavior of the model. So it's the one that's going to basically decide what the model is going to do. Okay, and because of that, it should be representative of the problem that we want to solve. What does that mean? Well, if I wanted to make a deep learning network to, I don't know, estimate the height of people from a picture taken from a particular distance, and I went and took those pictures just at the exit of some basketball team's training gym, we'd end up with a system that would very likely overestimate the height of people because it would have been trained in very tall people. Okay, and that would introduce bias in what our model would do. Well, it depends. If we only want to estimate the height of basketball players, that would be okay. But if we want to estimate the height of the overall population, then we need to train with pictures with very tall people, but also normal height people. So we need our training data to be representative of the problem that we want to solve. That's intuitively more or less easy to understand, but it's extremely difficult to do in practice, especially in research. Because precisely the point is that we do not know how our testing data is going to look like. Well, maybe the testing data, yes, but we do not really know how our data is going to look in practice. When someone is using our model, what will their data be? Well, that seriously limits the usability of deep learning problems. If you train, for example, to classify trees in Zhao Mountain, then if you get another dataset from Zhao Mountain, probably you will do fine. If you get a dataset from Italy, similar species, then you're going to have some problems, very likely. What things affect this? Well, for example, the distribution of classes. If we have exactly the same species, 3 species in 2 different datasets from 2 countries, but one country has much more, I don't know, Sakura or Nanakamado than the other, then the model trained with that different class balance is going to be naturally biased towards that class. That means that if you show me lots of examples of this particular species, the model will lump in low probability images with that species. So if you give me a new image and it's very clearly in one of the classes that the model has been trained to distinguish, it will do it correctly. But if it's a little bit of a strange image, then the model naturally will tend to default to the standard, and the standard means the class that is more present. So if the model has low probability, the model doesn't know what the image is or is not confident, it will lump it with the majority. This is a kind of a statistical bias, okay? So choosing a training set that really solves our problem, that really represents our problem, is crucial, is the most important part in any type of AI application. And here is another reason why I believe the applicability of LLMs and the type of products that ChatGPT, Claude, all of these represent is seriously limited. Because those models are meant to be trained to solve any possible answer, any possible question that any human can come up with. If you wanted to train a Claude model or a ChatGPT model to answer general factual questions about human history or human geography, maybe you could do that. You could build huge data sets and train the model, and the model would more or less end up reproducing those patterns. But I can ask ChatGPT about my feelings, and people use them as their boyfriend or their therapist or someone to yell at. Those are very different tasks. Because these models are being marketed as AI assistants, intelligent tools that can solve any questions, I think they are fundamentally doomed to failure. They base their success, which they are undoubtedly having, in the fact that when you ask someone or something, some deep learning network, some LLM, a question, usually you do not know the answer. These models are very good at creating grammar that looks okay. So if I ask a question and I get a beautifully worded answer, I will tend to trust that. They are also built so that they look like you're having a conversation with a human. And if you're having a conversation with someone that speaks calmly and reasonably, the answers look reasoned, you tend to trust them. So between you not knowing what you're asking about and the thing looking generally trustworthy, we tend to trust what we get from LLMs. But that does not mean that the answers are actually correct. That doesn't mean that the answers are actually what we want them to be. And if you ask an LLM about something that you know about, especially if it's something difficult, something that you have studied and so on, you will see that the precision of the things is very low. That if you push back, oh no, this thing that you have told me about what the results of my experiment means is not true. The LLMs don't care, have no where in their data, in their training about truth or about adequacy. They will just say, oh yeah, sure, you're right, no problem. The goal of the people who program the LLMs is to keep you asking questions, not really to give you the answers that you need, because they cannot do that in any meaningful way. Are they still useful? Sure, for many things. I mean, if I want to know the schedule for the bus from Sendai to Yamagata for tomorrow, and I don't mind if it's wrong, okay, again, my life doesn't depend on that, sure, then I can do that. I will maybe probably get it right. It's general information that I might not have. It's there somewhere. In this particular instance, LLMs fuck up more than half the time, okay? If I want to know the capital of Botswana, probably that one is right because that's a factual thing that's very easy to test, okay? LLMs also have different tools which are not artificial intelligence, what's called the harness, okay, built into them. So if the software detects that you are asking a coding question, a Python coding question, it will probably direct you to a submodel that is trained in many coding examples. So you probably get a better answer from that. Okay. But still, that doesn't change the fundamental fact that these models are not intelligent. They need to be trained for specific answers, for specific problems, and it's very easy to get them to end up in a part of the model that's not the one that you really wanted. And because of that, I think their usefulness is severely limited. Okay, that was about training data, which determines the behavior of the system and should be representative. Okay, and we said before that during training, we give the model the correct answer for all of its data. Okay. Validation data is also used during training, and it's used to prevent overfitting. What is overfitting? Very quickly, We said before that we have this data fitting problem, theoretical, about matrices, and where we only try to update the parameters of our models. That's a theoretical problem. That's one of the problems. The second problem is a practical one. And we hope the practical one, for example, classifying trees. What tree is there in this image? Is this other image showing a sick tree or a healthy tree? Where are the kanji in this page? That's practical. Okay, that doesn't particularly have to do with fitting data to models. So these are two separate problems, theoretical problem and practical problem. And we hope that by training a model to solve the first one, the theoretical one, we also get the same model that also solves the practical problem. But that connection is by no means guaranteed. Okay? When you finish the training process, you have a measure of how well you manage with the training data. Could I fit my model to this data or not? Okay, but you have no measure of whether or not that is going to be practical, useful in practice later when you get new data. A part of knowing a little bit about is the validation set. The validation set is a part of the training data set, which we separate at first. So we do not give the model the answers for the validation set. We only give the model the answers for the training. And we adapt the parameters and so on. And at each epoch, we look at the loss function for the training data set and also for the validation data set. And if the the loss for the training data set keeps going down, 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 and keeps getting better. And at some point, the loss for the validation dataset does not. If at some point the loss for the validation dataset, instead of going down like the loss for the training, flattens, that's what we call overfitting. That's a sign that we are only fitting our model to the training data and not to the general problem. In AI parlance, the problem is the model is overfitted to the training data and does not generalize. We want that the training step helps us capture the general characteristics of the problem as expressed by the training data. And we have the validation as a stopgap, as a control. If the loss of the validation flattens, then it means stop, we are overfitting. From now on, we are only fitting. The model is just kind of memorizing of fitting its weights very well, but only to the training data. Okay? We'll see an example of this in a second. And then the testing data, which we already introduced. So it should be as general as possible, and it should be completely different from the training and validation set. Okay? It should be different time, different site. If you use the same data for training, validation, and testing, or even a subset or a random subset data that has the same lighting characteristics, the same class balance, then you're cheating. You're getting nice numbers, but that doesn't mean that in practice you're going to get good results. And this part about mixing training, validation, and testing data sets is what most people get wrong. If you do that, you end up saying that you have a model to find kanji in WASM documents or to classify tree species, but you do not really have that. You have a model that solves that only for your data. And if you give it different data from the same species and so on, but from a different site, you will not be able to do it at the same level. Okay. As I said, two different problems, and let's just go to more or less quickly, to the next checkerboard classification notebook. Okay. Sorry, not this one. this one, I think. No, sorry, I was right before. So yeah. So the difference between this notebook and this notebook is that this one is running in Colab, and this one I have downloaded it, and I am running it in my computer, okay? And I'm doing it because this needs some computation, and I can explain this faster. Basically, here I have, this is a presentation that I use about some of the limitations of AI. This presentation starts saying the provocative thing that AI cannot count. And this comes from a famous example of ChatGPT not being able to count the R's in strawberry a couple of years ago. Okay. There are 2 R's in the word strawberry, which is not true because there is 1 here and 2 here. This comes from the fact that ChatGPT 4 in this case, as many LLMs, tokenizes, so breaks words into smaller sections and not particularly into letters as humans do usually. Okay, and that resulted in these kind of funny things. If you ask ChatGPT today how many R's are in strawberry, they will probably have fixed this, but that doesn't mean that the LLM works any different in its fundamental level. It probably means that it has now a model over itself as part of this harness that someone coded. If someone asks you about how many letters are in one particular word, then you connect to this simple letter counting code, which you guys could implement easily with a for loop processing strings. Okay, that's not artificial intelligence, that's marketing. Okay, so this notebook in particular started a little bit by making this provocation that artificial intelligence is not that intelligent because it cannot count. And here we are trying to teach a deep learning network to count something. Okay, so we already downloaded some code. You can do that in Colab. You can run this. This is the, as I said before, deep learning and computer vision basic 3. AI cannot count. Okay. And here we are going to generate checkerboard images. So we are going to generate these images made up of small cells of either 2 colors, which we are going to give it. So maybe in this case, the ones that we are going to use, the cells inside are going to be either red or blue. For example, this is 36% of blue, and then the rest is red. Okay, and here we have 42% of black and then green, the rest. Okay, so we define these functions to generate this type of notebooks that we are going to use, and then we are going to define very quickly datasets here. Okay, so I don't have the dataset defining functions here. I imported them from some code that I downloaded. Okay, I can actually show them to you. Yes. So here they are. When I run the code, I do some downloading here, git clone. I actually download from a Git repository, and then I end up with a subfolder that contains all of these files, and one of them is this dataset file. Okay, and this one has the init method like we saw, and it has the get item and so on and so forth. And then init method basically reads from the disk and sorry, it doesn't read from the disk. Goes over all the files in one folder and makes a note of the image names, and then in get item I read them. So this is different from what we saw before. Before we saw the init method read everything. This is just making a note of the name of the file, and then in get item reads this. This is slower than before, but leads needs less memory. Okay, and that's going to be useful for us in a quick second. Okay, so here what I am doing is that after I can generate those images, I can make some of them and I can make these data sets. For example, here I am making a testing data set. I'm starting from the final part. I'm doing the testing data set, okay? I could go and show you a folder with all of these images, but I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not doing that. But basically, if you run this in your Colab machine or if you run it in your computer, in your hard drive, you're going to have folders with those images, okay? And here I'm showing a few of them. I have made the testing data set with 50 images like this. So for example, this target is 3 because the amount of red pixels is between 30 and 40. And this one is 9 because the amount of red pixels is between 90 and 99%. I'm doing a classification problem where I try to guess how many red pixels there are. And I have divided the red pixels into categories. So I don't have to predict exactly the number, but more or less. Is it between 10 and 20? Is it 10 and 1999, 50 and 59.99, whatever. Okay, so I want to predict these classes. And to be able to do that, now I'm defining similar training sets. Okay, so this is a toy problem. This is a very simple problem. And here I'm defining a training data set, in this case, with 10 images. So I have 50 testing images and 10 training images defined in exactly the same way. Okay. I'm also breaking my training data set into training and validation. So I have about 8 of my training images for training and 2 of my training images for validation. And now I train a model. I train a ResNet 50 model for 10 epochs with this. And we will see next week a lot about what this training does and how does it work. Okay, but because I have very few images in my training set, I can do this very quickly. And what I end up here with is what we said before. The loss function for my training network goes down and down and down, and the loss function for my validation set, sorry, not training network, training set and validation set, goes flat after a few iterations, after 4 iterations, okay? And the accuracy is the same. The accuracy for the validation set is very low, and for the training set, it goes up very quickly. So the training accuracy starts at 0.12, and from epoch 2 becomes 1. So from epoch 2, I can classify all of my training images correctly. Good job, well done. Well, not really, because I cannot classify at any moment any of my validation images, which means that what I'm doing is that I'm just overfitting my problem. In this case, I do not have enough data to solve the problem that I want to solve about classifying the images in the test set, okay? So let's do it again, but now let's create that was with I can run this to see how I do with the test set, and what I do with the test set is basically shit. I always predict everyone is 90% and I get really low accuracy, 0.2, which is basically random accuracy, okay? Now I can train a training set with more images. Instead of having 10 images, now I'm going to have 100 images. So I'm doing the same thing, generating a training set with 100 images, and hopefully now I get something better. And I actually do. What I get now is training and validation loss that go down and the accuracies go up in parallel similarly. And when I run my confusion matrix with my testing set, and now I will say exactly what the confusion matrix is, I get very nice values, and I get 74% accuracy, okay? Basically, the difference is that now I have more images, probably enough images, and I get better results. What is this confusion matrix? Well, I have the predicted label in one side and the true label on the other. So if I get anything on the diagonal, then I'm golden. These are correct, okay? And what I get is that I get many of them, 74% in the diagonal. Not only that, but my errors, anything that's outside of the diagonal, are just beside the diagonal. So it means that this guy, I predicted to be, all of these guys, I predicted them to be class 7, so between 60 and 70, and they were actually class 6, so between 50 and 60. So this is a, let's say, minor error. So it's not like I said 10 and there were 100. I was quite close. So I make quite a lot of errors, but they are not so bad. Okay. I have still a few minutes, so let me, not many, but let me just quickly change this to 200 images and see if that improves the results dramatically or not. If I have 200 images, the thing is going to be a little bit slower training, okay? And I end up a little bit better, 80%, okay? So from 74 to 80%, doubling the images allowed me to improve the result a little bit more, but not that much. This is a toy problem. My training and validation tests are training and testing tests are very similar because I'm making up the data as I go along, but it illustrates the thing about the need to have enough data and the need to use the validation set to prevent overfitting. This is all very, how would I put it? Narrow, okay? So we could, by the way, do some interactive evaluation, try to do it ourselves, and we can see that pretty easily we have implemented a deep learning network that exceeds our own capacity to solve this problem about guessing how many red pixels there are in the images. Very quickly, with just 100 images, the network gets better than us, than humans at doing that, but in only a very narrow sense. If I now generate a test data set that's only the exact same thing, but I have changed the colors, so it's no longer red and blue, but now it's green and blue. I haven't even changed the two colors. I have only changed one of them. And I now try to use the model that I had already trained. I get, again, shit. I get nothing. My accuracy is 12%, and the confusion matrix is nonsense because it's just being predicted at the 5th and 6th level for some reason. Deep learning networks can get to be really good at some image processing tasks if the data is handled correctly, if the networks are trained correctly, if the data is representative, if the training data is representative of the problem and the testing data is different enough from it, we will get a read of how well we do in practice, but that's very narrow. If we change the conditions of the problem, then everything needs to be redone, okay? In narrow problems that we can define confidently, that we can have representative training data sets of, these can easily exceed human capacities, but only in this very narrow sense. Okay, and sorry, but I don't have time for questions now. Thanks for listening, and if you do have questions, please write them down and I will do my best to answer them by email or in next session. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.